Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie Pack, and I have with me today Rachel.
Hi, guys.
And today we're going to be talking about parenting, how addiction impacts parenting, and particularly we're going to be talking about fathers. I'm sure as we're talking about fathers, we'll mention mothers, but we do want to spotlight fathers. And one of the things that we see that we have to address with the clients that we work with is often, for whatever reason, addiction can make fathers step away from actually parenting and being involved in their children's lives. That can happen usually when they're involved in addiction. They're just not as present. I would include in this because we work with a lot of clients whose fathers were also not present in their life, maybe because of addiction, or this would still be addiction related, but more of a behavioral addiction. A lot of fathers can be workaholics in their job, or we see sometimes they're not workaholics in their job, but they have a church responsibility and they are a workaholic when it comes to the church. And that child is going to still experience an absent father. They're still going to experience what it would be like to have a father who is a workaholic, even if it is done on behalf of the religion and their beliefs. It's still showing up as an absent father. We also know that, like, nationally, it is a problem in this country that a lot of fathers are not involved in the parenting. And yet we also have fathers who, the millennials and maybe older Gen Z, Zennials, who are now becoming fathers, wanting more involvement in parenting. So there is that caveat. I want to say it's not all fathers. But we also know that if a couple gets divorced, fathers will largely relegate any responsibility that they have to their kids over the long haul. They may not initially, but over time they have less and less involvement in their children's lives. If the parents were never married, that's also something. And part of this, we have to acknowledge our court system is not updated. I think our family law courts do very well with couples who are divorcing, but couples who have had children together but never got married and do not have to go through divorce, the court is not designed very well in that situation to give fathers rights and to have fathers be in a position where they are involved in their child's life. So that population probably the most relegates active involvement in their children's lives. And that has lasting consequences on not just sons, but on daughters. But particularly let's talk about with sons who then grow up to be fathers and again did not maybe have a role model of what it's like to be a father. And I think some of this we have to talk about why it's important that dads are involved in kids' lives and the important role that they play, because sometimes I don't know that they know that. And when we start talking to our clients about that, as they're getting into recovery and we see them starting to show up and be more present and take an active role in their kids' lives, they usually will see the benefit to their kids. And we'll get into all of these things that I'm talking about here very quickly. But they also see the benefit to their lives being involved with their kids.
Yeah. And I do want to clarify, I think an addict in general, if you have an addiction, you're not going to be present in your kids' lives to the extent that you need to be, right? And that's why recovery is so important. I've heard women talk about this as being absent in their kids' lives or just not really understanding how their actions were affecting their children. We have some beliefs that our children just kind of grow up in a vacuum outside of our chaos, and that's not accurate.
Right.
Part of the reason we're focusing on fathers in this episode, and we might focus on mothers in another, is when, for the most part, moms are the primary parent if there is an addiction, even if the mom is the addict.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to talk about the role of fathers, the role of parenting, and really the emotional load or the emotional bandwidth that it takes in order to parent. And what happens when you adjudicate your responsibility as a parent and then step back in to that. Because I think that's also difficult. And specifically, we have left child raising to women historically to a certain point. And then there's no follow up on like what that actually looks like or how that actually shows up. But it does create father wounds. It does create mother wounds. And we want to talk about what it means to be in recovery as a parent.
Right. Right. And just the important role that fathers play in this equation, right? It's different than mothers for sure, but they play an important role nonetheless. And I don't know that that's really defined for them very well. The role that mothers are supposed to play is pretty well defined and hasn't changed a whole lot. I mean, some of the approaches have changed, in my opinion, for the better, but those are pretty well defined. And I don't feel like the role of father outside of provider has ever really been clearly defined.
Right. I mean, and even the role provider is very narrow about what we are providing.
Yes. But that's the one definition they're given.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about this. Like, what does it look like to not have a present father?
Well, I would know.
Right.
And I will say my parents were married. I think they separated. Well, I know they separated when I was 23. I think I've mentioned this before. It was intentional that, well, first of all, when my mom decided to separate from my dad, she did say that she thought it would be safer if she first asked just for a separation and not the divorce. Because going right for the divorce, she didn't know how my dad would respond to that. And she was worried about asking for the separation, but she also knew that she needed a year. So she wanted to separate for a year and was upfront with him and told him, I want to separate for a year. But she suspected that he would never pay child support, which he did not. And she just needed a year to prepare financially, mentally, I don't know, in all the ways that she was preparing for after a year to go ahead and file for divorce. Mm-hmm. So I was 23 when my mom asked for the separation. I was getting married at 23. And so it was planned that when we got home from our honeymoon, my mom would ask for the separation. My brothers, the two brothers under me, had mentioned to me, we had some guns in the house, not a lot. My dad wasn't really into hunting, or I don't know why he had guns, but he had guns. And so we were concerned enough that they were like, we need all the guns removed before mom asks for a separation. And so we had taken them out of the house and moved them into the apartment that we had rented so that there was no access to firearms when she was asking for the separation. And it was pretty anticlimactic. And then a year later, she filed for divorce. So I was 24 when my parents divorced. I mean, my youngest sibling was 7. So his experience growing up without a father was very different than mine. I still say I grew up without a father, even though my parents were married. My dad slept at the house, and that was about it. He was not involved in our life in positive, meaningful ways. I remember the week I was getting married, and so my wedding invitation is hanging on the fridge, and for the most part, if my dad walked into a room, I walked out. And I don't think I was the only one who would do that. It just was not comfortable to be in his presence. You didn't know how he was gonna engage with you. And most of the time he just wouldn't engage with you. So that was also kind of awkward to be in the kitchen and have somebody walk in, who's your dad, and they say nothing to you and you don't know what to say to them. And typically I would just leave. But this night, it was about midnight. I had gotten home from being with my fiance, and I was in the kitchen getting something to eat. And my dad came home from work, I'll say in parentheses, from work, and was in the kitchen. And I just said, hey, Dad, are you coming to my wedding this week? Or no, I said, hey, Dad, are you going to be able to make it to my wedding? And he said, Jack, I wouldn't miss that for the world. And I was like, oh, okay. And he's like, when is it? And I said, well, it's in 2 days. And he was like, wouldn't miss it for the world. And I'm thinking to myself, well, had we not had this midnight encounter in the kitchen, you might have. Even though there's literally an invitation hanging on the fridge, you've clearly not looked at it. And it was not on your radar that this was happening in 2 days. I will say he almost did not show up because him and my mom got in this big fight the morning of my wedding. My husband came to pick me up. My dad got in his car, peeled out of the driveway, left. My husband was like, is he going to be at the wedding? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe. If he remembers. I don't know. I told him 2 days ago, but I don't know what he will remember. So he was largely, I feel like we were largely raised by a single mom with this biological father who slept at the house and was there on Sunday because where he worked was closed on Sundays. And Sundays were horrible at our house typically. So my brothers grew up largely without a father. So did me and my two sisters. And my younger two siblings really did not grow up with a father because he was avoiding child support. So they literally had no contact with him at all because then my mom might give ORS, the Office of Recovery Services, his address or find out where he's working, and then he would have to pay child support. And when they got divorced, he successfully avoided child support until the youngest was 18. It just went away. He didn't continue to owe that. That wasn't a debt that he had ongoing. So that happened.
Yeah. And I think when we have that kind of person in our lives who's not emotionally engaging, who's not, I'm like, it's 2 days before your wedding.
Right.
And Dad's like,
yeah, wouldn't miss it for the world.
Wouldn't miss it for the world. I mean, he's missed so much at that point,
Right.
right? And I do think that toll, and we can see this on small scales, right? When you have kids who, like, Dad's sitting right there and they're like, Mom, Mom, Mom. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a level of children get used to not having a dad, but there's a huge wound there.
Yes.
Right? Like, this is half of my identity that doesn't want anything to do with me.
Yeah.
Or can't have anything to do with me.
Right.
And so we'll see a lot of the parenting, especially early on, falling to mom, right? Mm-hmm. Like how to teach these children how to be decent humans. Mm-hmm. And that's exhausting. But this is also where we can see like the Disneyland dad who only does fun things with the kids.
Right.
Or is only engaged on their terms, right? Like I think that there's a level of when parents aren't involved because they don't get it. I hear this sometimes with like dance moms, mm-hmm. Specifically, where the dads are like, I have to go to this thing. Okay, but you have 3 daughters in dance. Mm-hmm. So maybe you get to understand what dance is.
Right.
Versus this like, oh, it's just this girl's thing. And with boys, right, like I've heard where like one boy was really involved in a sport that dad liked, but the other one was not. And so mm-hmm. the other boy gets less time with dad or less connection time with dad. And all of that creates wounds because mm-hmm. for children, it's what's wrong with me? Right. Not what's wrong with dad, but what's wrong with me.
Right. And even the son that is getting a lot of attention because he's involved in sports, sometimes they don't like that. Right. They're like, Dad, you're too involved. Let me and my team do my thing. Stop trying to coach me. Stop trying to be my coach.
Right.
Just let me
be my dad.
Yeah. I will say the research that we know, the important role that dads play, and I would say this, all of our kids are in their 20s. And I would say this was true. Dads tend to be a little bit more rough and tumble with their kids. We have 4 daughters. He wasn't necessarily different. I think probably had he had sons, he might have been a little bit more rough and tumble, but he was rough and tumble with his daughters as well. And dads typically encourage their kids to take risks. Again, at small ages, that may be like, can you jump from here to here? And can you jump off of this and I'll catch you, right? Like it's those types of risks when they're little. And if you've ever seen a dad doing that and the kid squeals as dad catches them, right? And they feel so brave, that is an important role. Dad's encouraging them to take risks grows as the child grows. And dad is like, go for this. And I think you should do this. And that's awesome. I think that's an important role, an active role that dads play.
Yeah. I mean, as you were saying that, I was thinking about my brother-in-law when his oldest son, the youngest one was a baby, but his oldest son was like 3. And at this point, it wasn't even I'm going to prepare dad to catch me. It was just I'm jumping. And I was always amazed at how quickly my brother-in-law could get there.
Right.
And catch him, right? There was this trust. And I do remember this one particular conversation between my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law where she was like, you're encouraging bad behavior, essentially. And she was really concerned that her son was going to get hurt because he was jumping off of some pretty high things at that point. And he was like, he's going to learn, and I'm here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Which I think that he's got to learn, and I am here is such a definitive line for dads. I think about my dad, who was pretty present. And I haven't talked a lot about my parents, but my dad also had a undiagnosed anxiety disorder. So he was pretty ragey as a kid. But my dad was present. My dad went to all of our doctor's appointments. And he's actually the reason I got into horses. He's the reason that I showed. He's the reason I trained. I don't know that I would have developed the resilience that I have as an adult had I not had a dad who was like, get up and go, do it again. There was one particular time I had a horse accident. It wasn't terrible. I did hurt my knee in it, but it's fine. It's fine now. But I remember that fear, that anxiety of not wanting to get back on the horse. And like, I trusted my horse with my life. We were very in sync. And my dad was like, she's not going to hurt you. You've got to get back on. I don't know that I would have done that had he not been there. And my mom was absolutely like, no, give her a break, give her a break, give her a break. And my dad was like, no, she's good enough to get in a saddle. She needs to get back on. And I do think that there's that level of like what our dads fear, and when our dads are not present, that becomes bigger, right? It becomes that like we don't have a safety net. And I think moms play a different role in protecting kids and nurturing kids, but it's rare that you're going to see mom being able to do both. Right? If mom is protecting and nurturing, it's also going to be difficult for her to be like, yeah, jump off this 6-foot thing. Yeah, let's go rock jumping, right?
Or even to have the emotional bandwidth to engage with her kids that way. Because I'm thinking of my mom. There were 6 kids. She's largely a single mom. She worked.
Right.
And I just don't know that her personality wasn't one that she was going to really play with the kids in that way. But she would not have had the emotional bandwidth to do that. So it's like, I don't have time for that. Like, we're walking, right? Stop trying to jump. Stop trying to dilly-dally.
Right.
We're moving. And again, I think with single parenting, sometimes that the play, the exploration, the risk-taking does get lost.
Right, because we're on a schedule. Yeah, and I think that, like even with like my partner and my child, the amount of times that we have to get something done and he's just like, I'll go play with her.
Yeah.
Right. And so we can get whatever we're done because he's occupying the child. And now she's a little bit older and she can be involved in things, but there was a lot of that passing kid back and forth in the like letting her play, letting her explore, letting her be who she was while we were also trying to adult. And it's just hard to do that with one parent.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking there was a time our kids would have still been kind of young. There's a 7-year difference from our oldest to our youngest. And so probably the 3 oldest, which were all in a 3-year period, not planned. Maybe the oldest was around, 5 or something like that. And my husband and I were sitting outside one evening, probably in the summer, and they're playing out in the front yard. And our rule was if you played in the front yard, an adult had to be there with you. You could play in the backyard by yourself because fences and not vehicles going down a road. And so we were out there and one of our kids got hurt. And they actually came over to their dad. And I don't remember exactly, but he was basically like the message he would say to them is, you're okay. You're tough. You're going to be fine. And he would send them back. And I said to him, maybe you could comfort them a little bit before sending them back out. Like, I appreciate what you're doing, but you could also give them some comfort. And he looked at me and he said, you think you're a better parent than I am, right? And I kind of sat there for a minute and I said, yeah. And he said, I know you do. And he's like, but let me point something out. He's like, typically if our kids get hurt and they come to you, you comfort them. You might give them a kiss or give them a hug or hold them on your lap for a minute. And he's like, and typically with me, I might say, oh yeah, look, it's bleeding. You're tough and go out there and get back on it, right? And he's like, and we're pretty predictable in that way, I think, to our kids. And we are both sitting here available. And they came to me. And I was like, yeah, they did. He's like, they could have come to you if they needed to be comforted. They knew you would have given them that. But they came to me. And he's like, I don't think one is better than the other. I think it's important that our kids have both. They have both options. And then they decide who they go to depending on what their need is. And, you know, I want to say again, of course I had dad issues coming into this. And I wasn't even fully aware of the impact of having an absent father in my life until seeing my kids engage with my husband, their dad, and the way that he engaged back with them. In many ways, it healed a lot of my dad wounds, seeing that. But there were these biases I had, right? And there were times that, you know, like this example, yeah, I did think I was a better parent. And when he made his point, I couldn't argue with that.
Right.
Like, that had literally just happened. They could have come to either one of us and they went to him. But I didn't quite know how to fully integrate that. It's not like I was different. Like the wound was healed and I was completely a different parent. No, it took a couple of more instances like that, sometimes where we're both available and we're together and the kids call him and they don't call me. And I mean, I would always know what they called him about. Sometimes he would put it on speaker if we could. But I was just like, when they know both of us are available, sometimes they actually call him. And at first I felt guilty. Like, oh, it's because I'm a working mom and I'm not always there for them and I'm not always available. I didn't say that, but that was my initial reaction to that. Right. And then I'm like, no, just be glad they can call both of us. And sometimes they call him. And that doesn't mean that I shouldn't work or that I'm not available enough. It is okay for my kids to learn that sometimes I am not available.
Right.
And for them to learn that sometimes dad is not available. So I don't think that that's a bad learning for kids. But I did have to see the bias that I had. Because again, I would have never called my dad.
Right.
I mean, I couldn't have gotten a hold of him. He rarely ate meals with us. On Sunday, he would eat dinner with us. And usually we might be having a conversation and somebody might address him and he didn't know, right? And then we'd be like, Dad, what? Well, we're talking to you. What? You know, and it's just like, okay, yeah, even the one meal a week that he ate with us, he was not present.
Right. Well, and I think that that's a great example and kind of leads into what you and I wanted to talk about in terms of parenting styles and differences that show up in parenting and how if we have an addict, and I mean, specifically, we're talking about male addicts at this point, right? Who have kind of adjudicated their parenting role because they're addicts. And the reality is it's hard to be present.
Right.
Period.
Right.
If you're escaping to addiction.
Like, well, and for a lot of addicts, they spend a lot of time in numbing, they spend a lot of time in escaping. And so that also means they are not emotionally available to their partner or to their children because they have not learned how to navigate emotions. So an emotion comes and they're trying to numb it, they're trying to escape it, they're trying to suppress it. And a lot of what we're talking about is some emotional availability when we're talking about being present.
But what we'll often see, at least what I see in my practice, we'll sometimes start to see addicts in recovery, like actually I see this a lot, where they start to come online and they want to be parents. They want to be present. They want to be involved. They
have opinions about parenting.
And they start to recognize, I can show up here. This is a place where I can show up and I can be here for my kid, whatever that is. But it's different than what mom has been doing. And mom has been keeping the lifeboat afloat. And so we can see a lot of contention around, I don't like the way you're parenting, or, you know, you're not doing it right. And we'll often see, at least, you know, with my male addicts, with my fathers in recovery, I will see them go like, well, I have been. And so maybe I should just default to her because I have been absent. And I think that there are things that we can learn from that, right? I definitely think that there's a place where we have to observe, like, what is working with the way that my wife parents or the way that my partner parents and what is not.
Which, to be clear, she's been a single parent.
Right.
So not that she's necessarily doing it wrong or bad.
Right.
But single parenting would be very difficult.
Right.
And if we can co-parent, that's always going to be better. And so when I'm working with partners, we both work with partners, we both work with addicts. And so if I'm working with a female partner and their spouse in addiction recovery starts to show up in the parenting thing, usually they're bugged. They do not appreciate this. They are like, it is a little too late for you to show up with your opinions and want to change what I've got going on. And I have to work with them through that and say, hey, you don't have to do it alone anymore.
Right.
And that's been hard.
Right.
And it is good if he wants to play an active role, and he will parent differently than you. He will. And that's okay. You don't have to, I mean, you should adjust some of how you're doing it because you've been doing it as a single parent. Mm-hmm. And now they have another parent who's available to them. You guys should team up in that, whether they're married or not, or whatever it is. I'm like, that is a good thing.
Yeah.
And it is going to be different than you. Now, again, can he, if you set boundaries for the kids, can he also support your boundaries? Sure. And vice versa, right? Or if he says to you, hey, I think you've kind of been a little harsh here. I get it, but you might need to. I will tell my clients, not in front of your kids, you're not going to disagree with their mom. But you might later say to her, hey, I think that was a little harsh. I get it. They were not being respectful or whatever. But do you really want them grounded for 2 weeks? Because that seems a little, excessive. And what's the point of that? They're not going to remember in 2 weeks, right? And then they can come through that together. And then mom comes out and is like, hey, I might have overreacted. Here's what that's going to look like. And mom gets to adjust it. Mm-hmm. And the kids don't need to know that dad had a voice in that.
Right. I mean, I also think there's this beautiful thing that happens, right, when we've been treading water and keeping the lifeboat afloat, mm-hmm. and then we have a partner who starts to show up. Mm-hmm. And it gets messy and it gets a little rocky because, whatever. But it also gives us the ability to look at what of my boundaries were just to keep the lifeboat afloat, mm-hmm. and how many of those actually are integrated in what I believe around children.
Right. Or about how I wanted to be a parent, mm-hmm. how I thought of myself being a parent before having kids, right?
Right. And so it creates some space for us to adjust and mm-hmm. correct and redirect. And I tell people all the time, we're not raising children. And I think that mm-hmm. that is a problem. That is a mind belief that we have, that we're raising children. And if you want a non-functional adult when they leave the house, okay, then raise children. But what we are trying to do is take these little fleshy bodies and get them to adulthood in a functional way, which means that they need to be able to have choices. They need mm-hmm. to be able to take safe risks. Mm-hmm. They need to be able to, figure out what mm-hmm. consequences are. And if they make a choice, what are the consequences that come after that? And that kind of parenting takes a lot more time and a lot more mental agility that we just don't have if we don't have a partner supporting that. And so I do think one of the things that does happen here is when we have both parents present and both parents showing up emotionally, we have more bandwidth to allow our kids to grow and get past the fact of obedience, or get past the fact of following the rules, because we need our kids to follow the rules if mm-hmm. we're a single parent.
Right.
Because it's just like chaos if they don't.
Well, and we need compliance, which is a different way of engaging with your child to create compliance than it is to create this human being.
Yeah. Right.
And sorry to interrupt again. I think sometimes that with single parents, it does require the kids to grow up too soon. They have more responsibilities than is age appropriate. I mean, my kids always had responsibilities, but when they were 5 and under, they liked having responsibilities, but they were hardly that contributive to the household. But sometimes that is necessary with single parenting, where they're having to grow up a little bit because they don't have two functional parents managing the business of life.
And so I do think that just allows for more space, mm-hmm. and allows for the kids to be a little bit messy and figure things out mm-hmm. in a different way.
And for that mom to make choices about who she is and how she parents. And that's where we see sometimes partners get hung up because maybe they do have some shame about how they've had to parent. And, different than the addict. And we tell the addict, especially depending on the ages of your children, you are going to have to recognize that you've been absent and that you're available. They will sense if you're available, But you have to have a conversation about that. And you have to validate that they aren't wrong, that you were not available and now you are. And moms have to make that acknowledgement too, that I was not always available as I wanted to be and did some things that I don't necessarily agree with, or looking back, I have some regret over. I don't think that's going to damage the kids or really damage you as a person to have to acknowledge that to your children or your teenagers and to say, we want to do it different now.
Right. And we don't talk about this as much, but I think that we have to, is the grief that comes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like I have heard so many parents say, and I've had clients do this where they want to have another baby to do it right, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. I'm like, no, right. We don't get to do that. Mm-hmm. I mean, you might be able to have another child, but it's not to do it right.
Right.
You're going to have to grieve that mm-hmm. part. You're going to have to grieve being a single mom during that time. You're going to have to grieve being an absentee dad during that mm-hmm. time. Like that is part of the process, and we don't mm-hmm. get to bypass that.
Right. You have to live in the reality of what was and be accountable for that in order to really make the adjustments that you want to and have your kids accept those adjustments.
Right. And allow them to do that in a way that makes sense to them, mm-hmm. which I think is the important part of this. Like you don't get to bypass their own feelings about that.
Right.
And some kids have pretty big feels uh-huh. when you come back online.
Yeah. I have to say, I have thought about this. I mean, it never happened. My dad's he passed away, I don't know, 16 years ago, maybe 17. I don't know where we're at. A lot of times when I think about my dad, I have memories, but sometimes the things in my adult life, like the year he died, I'm like, I don't know. I don't remember what year it was. I can kind of figure out the math by the ages of my kids and stuff like that. Whereas you ask me the year my mom died and I know it, I don't have to piece things together. But there were times, so when my dad married his third wife, she had never had children. She had never been married before my dad. And initially, I kind of felt bad for her because I didn't think my dad was a very good partner. He wasn't to his second wife. I kind of came to be like, oh, I think they're actually pretty good matched, if not in a way I would want to be matched, but they are fairly equally matched. And the first time we met her was maybe a year after they we didn't know they had gotten married. That's how much my dad communicated. And I think he brought her to my youngest sibling's wedding. And that's the first time we met her, but I think they'd been married a year or so prior to that. And she was like, when I met him, I was so excited to hear he had 6 kids because I've never had kids. And I was so excited to marry somebody who had kids, right? And I'm kind of thinking, and he didn't tell you or you didn't notice that he hasn't talked to them in a year. And this is before social media, so it's not like he knew what we were doing. I don't know who he would have heard that from because my grandma, his mother, when my mom decided to get a divorce, she cut us all off. So my grandma didn't know what we were up to. She didn't talk to us. So I don't know how my dad would know anything about us. But, we started, and they were married for 4 years before my dad died. So not a long time, but we would get together the week between Christmas and New Year's for 1 hour. At that point, we spent 1 hour a year with my dad. And at the end of that hour, he would always look at his watch and he would say, "This has been so great." And there was a part of my stomach that would clench because I'm like, he wants to do this more often. Now, I think there was a part of me that longed for a dad, right? But not him, not the way he was. He would have had to have changed dramatically for me to want him as my dad, right? And so I would kind of clench my stomach because I'm like, oh no, what's he going to want from us? And then he would say, "I can't wait to do this next year." And then I'd be like, that's weird. He's literally okay with seeing all 6 of us. And at this point, some of us are married. Some of us have kids. He's literally okay seeing us once a year. And it's not like we had phone calls in between then. We saw him 1 hour a year for 4 years, and then he died. And there was a part of me that thought if he really changed, I don't think it would have been too late for me to have a dad in my life. If he just started demanding things, I wasn't going to cooperate with that. But there was that wound there, and I knew there was that wound there. Mm-hmm. And particularly, I think I've mentioned this to you before, my third daughter, from the time she was born, daddy's girl. And all of my kids love their dad and have great relationships with him. But she was like tied to his. I mean, we have so many pictures of him sitting on the couch, and she's like, he's reading her a book, and she's over his head, looking down at the book from on top of his head, because she's climbed up his back, and that's how she was when she read the book. And she just was always all over him. And she, in many ways, was a daddy's girl. And I remember at one point watching them and being like, I think I was a daddy's girl. I just never had a dad who was interested in that or available for that. But I think, and people will often say, of my 4 kids, she is the most like me. I don't see it. I'll joke and be like, I had an 80s hairstyle and she never did, fortunately. But a lot of people will say of the 4, she is a mini me. And I was just like, I think I have that dad wound and can recall back to, we're talking 3, 4, 5 years. I think by 5, I was like, no, not this guy. But just seeing that, that is a pretty deep wound.
Yeah. Right. Because it's the person you connect with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the person, and I think that speaks a lot to like what we're talking about in terms of stepping into parenting and stepping into this space of our kids need us, right? Like they need us.
They need both parents.
They need both parents. And biologically, we know that. Biologically, we know that at least until about the age of 8, children need more hands-on parenting than they will ever need again.
Mm-hmm.
By the age of 8, we're building attachment, right? Mm-hmm. We're showing people what you need to expect in relationships, what you should, and for daughters, we're showing them what your partner should be like.
Right.
And for boys, we're showing them how you should treat your partner. Mm-hmm. We're showing them how you should show up, how you should engage. Mm-hmm. And when you have one parent or you have one parent holding all the emotional bandwidth, kids are not getting that. And so there is a little bit of this level of, I talk to male addicts all the time about, I don't know what it means to be a man. And then we get this weird, like, pseudo-toxic masculinity that shows up.
Right.
Because they didn't get that or they didn't know what that was. And a lot of hate for women who couldn't play both roles. And so the reality is when we step into parenting, when we choose to have a child, we are choosing to be involved. We're choosing to be present. We're choosing to show them how to get to adulthood. And some of that does require our own recovery work, right? Like I don't know that we can do that from a place of numbing and fantasy and stepping out because we're not teaching them how to live in their bodies. We're teaching them how to get out of their bodies. But when we do step back into that role, what we're teaching them is, hey, you can be present through hard things. You can be resilient. You can grieve. You can have emotions. And all of those are okay.
I'm just thinking, because we do have some issues going on with young men and with men, right? Again, not all men, but we do have issues. And I think some of what we are talking about are the origin sources of why men are struggling more than women are. And I will also say women or girls, let's say daughters, respond differently to an absent dad than sons do. I have definitely some of the conversations I have with my brothers. Again, they don't want to talk about it very much. Occasionally I can catch them in a time when they are talking about it. And I just think that the wound goes even deeper for them and the impact was much larger. They felt a much larger impact. I have to say my brothers are good dads, but they are creating something they had no model for. In fact, they had a bad model for because our dad, when he was around, he could also be violent. And we saw that towards our mom and all of the kids minus the youngest who experienced it personally. But I think my brothers experienced it even more than me, like fist punches, like things like that I might have gotten tossed across the room, but I was never punched, right? And so that wound goes, I do think there is a difference. And we have the research that says girls from single parent households tend to do better than their brothers. And we have to talk about that. And I think some of that is that the masculinity that is available for them without a man in their household. And I will say here, One of my kids dated a guy, they just broke up. I don't know what will happen with that relationship. They dated for 8 years. He seemed like part of our family. And she just recently broke up with him. My youngest daughter dated a guy who dad had pretty much relegated any parental responsibility. And you could see the lack of skills that he had. And he didn't know he didn't have them. The other one, his mom pretty quickly got into a relationship. They haven't technically married, but we just refer to this guy as his stepdad. And we've done things with the family. And I will say, like, I think he has a very different trajectory because of the stepdad. You know, his dad is still there, not really active in his life, which I think is a good thing because dad's not really a positive influence in his son's life. But stepdad has stepped in and done an amazing job with him and his brother. That is who I think they would look to as a father figure. I mean, I know they do, right? They would look to him as a father figure more than their own father. So there are a lot of men stepping in and playing this father role for sons who do not have that. And my brothers had that too. It was a little tricky for us because all of the neighbors thought we had a dad. And so I don't think the men wanted to step in as much, but my brothers did not have a dad. But they did have some men who would step in and I don't know, and they knew the extent that they were stepping in to, but that had a significant impact on my brothers. There was a story, there's probably research being done about it, an elementary school in Louisiana. And they were having a lot of behavioral problems with the boys in the elementary school. And so they put out a call to the community to have fathers come to the school and spend time. And they kind of call it, it's not the best term, but they call it garbage time. Just showing up being a dad. Dad jokes, dad humor, dad just showing up and being there in these boys' lives. And
yeah, I've seen like where they'll, if they're having like behavioral issues or something, like the dads will just go shoot hoops on them.
Or they would show up about lunch and they talk about farts and whatever, because dads do that with their kids. Right. And some of the dads showing up, they had kids in the elementary school. Others were just dads in the community who had time and donated it, showing up to the school. And they started to see a turnaround in behavior problems because dads will also let them know where the limits are in ways. I mean, moms do it differently. Kids know when they've crossed the limit with dad, and hopefully dad appropriately lets them know that. And it's not like a shame thing. They started to see test scores rise and all sorts of things. And again, these weren't all biological dads. They were just men who, for whatever reason, decided this was a value. And to me, as much as they helped these boys' lives, I'm sure in turn, it also benefited their life. They got some richness from showing up at the elementary school and being dads.
And I mean, I think that that's a thing too, right? When we look at how schools are structured. A lot of the volunteer hours are within school hours. Most of that is done by at-home moms or things like that. And I have watched my partner show up. He does most of the volunteer work that we have to do because my schedule is
not as flexible.
And he works from home. So he lives 3 minutes from the school. He works 3 minutes from the school. So he can like show up for things like that I can't always adjust schedule to get there. And it's always amazing to me how many of the moms are like, oh, we're so glad you're here.
Yeah.
Like, I think that there's a recognition that we need more dads present. And our system doesn't really allow it.
Right. I mean, I do think this is why it's important for men to go into education.
Yeah, but not administration.
Not administration, right? But men are more likely also, if they become teachers and if they become elementary school teachers, they're also more likely to raise the price of the salary of teachers in general because they're men. And we still believe that we can pay women less to do the same job. And so men going into those careers are also going to benefit their female counterparts because they're going to expect higher wages over time, right? I mean, it's not like an instant thing. But yeah, I just think that benefit to having males in classrooms, whether it's teachers, volunteers, substitute teachers, that's so valuable.
And I also think it's good to look at if there are not men close up, the options that we have in Hollywood or in media, they're not great.
Right.
You know, I was just talking to a friend of mine about there's some research coming out around the types of video games that kids play, and kids who play RPGs, which are role-playing games where there's a story and you have to kind of figure it out, are more likely to have empathy than kids who are playing first-person shooter games, which totally makes sense. Like, one, you're having to figure out a story. The other one, you're shooting things. But a large portion of our video games are this lone wolf man taking on alien races. And that doesn't really teach you how to be human. That doesn't really teach you how to engage in relationships. That doesn't teach you how to talk to girls or guys, whatever. It doesn't teach you how to talk to your significant others. It doesn't teach you how to build empathy with someone else.
Right.
And if you don't have someone in real time teaching you that, moms in addicted or non-relationships who are having to single parent are not in functional relationships. So we're not learning that from our parent structures if that's the kind of parenting we're doing. I think it's incredibly lonely for men. I think it is incredibly lonely to not have the dad to talk to, or the grandpa, or the whatever.
Or right? Other dads to talk to.
We do have a system that has, and I think about this with all of the issues with different religious organizations getting in trouble for sexually abusing boys, Boy Scouts of America getting in trouble. These places that we have historically had places to put children are also not seen as safe. And so, like, we need safe dads. We need safe men in those roles. And the only way we get safe men in those roles is if they've done the recovery and have healed some of those wounds so that they can step into that space.
And I know you and I, and you know, you're the clinical director at the company that I own, and so we hire some young therapists, like meaning young to the field. They're not always young in age, but they're young to the field, and I think it's a benefit. They're in a learning place, where sometimes therapists who've been in for a long time are just same old, right? But there's a big investment on our part up front to get them up to the level of work that we want them to be at. And also, this is an area of specialty that they don't really get exposed to in grad school or anywhere else, not to the degree that they will when they work with us. I've said before, I think for males in sex addiction recovery, I think it is very important for them to have a female voice as part of their recovery. That may not be their primary therapist. That may be a group therapist. Therapy is more female dominated of a field, but we do have clients who want to work with male therapists, and that's fine. We usually have males that can accommodate their schedule, but I think they need female voices as part of that. Number one, they start to hear their partner working with a female therapist. And I also want our male therapists to be able to have that partner narrative, which is why, if possible, I want all of our therapists working with both female partners, male addicts, male partners, female addicts, whatever that looks like. We have to have that other narrative in our head because of the work we're doing with a client in order to do really good work with this one that we're working with. And so I think it's good to have a male narrative as well, but I think you should be exposed to both. And again, I am not unaware that in many ways we are mimicking parenting for our clients by having female voices and male voices. And I think that's one of the benefits to having a mixed team, because we have had male therapists work for us who, in even small ways for their colleagues, offer what men can offer. And I think sometimes also receive what females can offer. And so we also see that play out on our team, not just for our clients, but also for us as therapists. And I just think we have gender wounds. And often you and I will, this is where I was going, you and I will often say the villain is patriarchy.
Right.
This is not, we're not anti-man, we're not pro-woman, or we're not anti-woman and pro-man. Patriarchy damages both genders. And we have to keep that in mind working with this person who, sometimes has done things that goes against our moral compass. And often I will say, what helps me is I'm looking at this wounded boy who's now grown up and is a man without a lot of skills to function in the world as a man. And he is seeking love, belonging, all of those things that were not offered, many times because of patriarchy and the messaging about what boys need and what boys don't need that really does some damage to them.
Right. I also think, I was just thinking about all of our male colleagues that I have really revered and enjoyed working with. And I think there's this level too in which they can show up and show what a healthy male looks like, right? And for most of our clients, they've never seen that.
Right.
And I think that that's kind of a beautiful thing. Also, I love working with those male colleagues. There's perspective and things that they create and give that like I just won't have. And I appreciate that and value that. And I do think you and I have talked about this multiple times that for real change to happen, there has to be healing between the genders. And I think that is true across the board. And I think that we're talking about that in a sliver today in parenting, that there has to be some healing in the parenting and showing up as functional adults with our children. But I do think that that shows up. I do think that you and I step into parent roles often with our clients.
Yeah.
I think that most therapists do who are doing this work at some point, not in a way that we're violating boundaries or ethics.
Right. But there's some reparenting happening in the therapeutic relationship.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I do think that all of those things are incredibly important. And as we're looking at showing up and being present, I think is the biggest part. As we're talking about being present, it doesn't mean that we have to have all the answers of how to parent, right? Typically, we don't abuse. We don't break a child's spirit. Those are the rules. But like, there's a lot of flexibility in how to parent outside of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I also think one of the things I tell my clients is I don't know, let's say there's 101 ways to be a good parent.
Right.
I think it's so important to know the best way for you to parent. And the way that you know that is to really get to know yourself inside and out, flaws, imperfections, regrets, whatever that is, right? And not tip into shame, but to make meaning of that. And then to know how to extend that in a parenting way. And ironically, in my household, we have had, like right now, Lillian lives with us. She's lived with us for 5 years. But prior to her living with us, we have had 3 boys who lived with us for various periods of time. The first one, he was 15 when he moved in. And honestly, my daughter, who used to bring home stray animals and injured birds and whatever, brought home this boy. And she was older than him. And she just brought him home, like had met him that day at her friend's house. It was her friend's sister's friend. And he didn't want to go home. And they'd asked her, the family was leaving. They asked her to take him home. And then he's like, I don't want to go home. And so she's driving around. It's after 10. He's like, let's go to Starbucks. They go to Starbucks. Let's go to McDonald's. So finally, he's just like, I don't want to go home. And she's like, okay, I do. Do you want to come to my house? And he's like, sure. And so he slept over on the couch, and we woke up to a text from her saying, hey, there's a kid asleep on the couch downstairs. His name's Aaron. And we were like, what? And then he lived with us for a year. And I've seen my husband interact with males in our household. In some ways, like I knew he did this for our daughters. It's slightly different when he did it for them, and he was not their dad. And there were things like, I remember for this kid, he was spending some time with his family, and it was from where we lived maybe an hour away. He was at this cousin's house, and he was going to sleep over. And it was at 2:00 in the morning, and my husband gets a text on his phone, and he woke up. My phone is always on silence, and I probably wouldn't wake up to the sound of a text, but he woke up, and I kind of wake up because he's putting his pants on, and I'm like, where are you going? And he's like, oh, he texted me, and he doesn't feel safe, and he wants me to come get him. And he's like, I told him to drop me a pin, and I'm heading on my way. And I was just like, wow, I think I provide safety in a very different way. I wouldn't have wanted to go at 2:00 in the morning to pick this kid up. And I don't know that I would have felt safe, right? But he was just like, I'll be back. And I was like, okay. So the next morning we wake up, and I said, do you know what was going on? And he's like, I got a short summary of what was going on. And he's like, I mean, he didn't want to talk a lot about it, but he just said, I just didn't feel safe. And I just told him, if you don't feel safe, then you did the right thing, and I'll come get you. And wherever you are, if you're not safe, I will come. I don't care what time it is, I will come. And he's like, and he didn't say much after that. And he's like, so I don't know. Like, he didn't push, right? And he's like, and then we just rode in silence. And I would imagine that felt like a very safe car ride.
Right.
He didn't have to say anything. And the silence was not awkward.
Right.
It was just like, I got you.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stories like that I can give about my husband that I've seen him engage with my kids' friends. Sometimes even like one of their girlfriends is over, and he walks in from work, And he's like, hey, whose car is this? Say the color. And they'll be like, oh, that's mine. He's like, your tires are low. The pressure is low. You can't drive on low tires. Let's go out and I will teach you how to check your tire pressure and put air in your tire. And they're like, I didn't know that, right? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, I don't look at tires on my way in the house. But he does, right? And he was just like, yeah, let's go out. And then usually some other kids are like, I don't know how to do that. And he's like, you guys need to know this. Come on out. Let's do this.
Right.
And again, I mean, I know how to do this, but I'm really grateful that he's just like, oh, you don't know how to do this? You need to know. And air pressure will happen and you will have to know how to fill it up and what it should go to. And so he'll give the whole instructions out in the garage and whatever. And I'm just like, again, just improving a life there in a way that a man would. And I love that.
Yeah. And I think that we just need more of that.
We do need more of that. And I think for men, they have to know the young men need you. Because again, let me just go on a little bit of a rant, okay? So I think it was yesterday. At least I saw it yesterday. I don't watch Fox News, but I know who Jesse Waters is. And much of what I see clips of him, this is one of the problems. If this is what boys have out there that's being offered, that is a problem. And so there was a clip that he showed Kamala and Doug at the grocery store. And he was like, what man goes to a grocery store? Like, that's so weird that this man is at the grocery store. Hey, I was like, I see men in the grocery store all the time, by the way. And I don't do the pickup order because I don't trust other people to pick my food. And I don't mind going grocery shopping. I enjoy it. But men stop by the grocery store all the time. Their wife is home with the kids and they're like, hey, stop and get this on the way home.
Or
they're single and they don't eat out all the time and they want to learn how to cook and buy food, right? And so, first of all, I was like, are you kidding me? What man goes to the grocery store? But he's also kind of implying, he didn't overtly say this, but to me, I read into this, so this is me. Also, if you have a woman to go to the grocery store, which she's clearly there too, why would you be there? And again, my husband doesn't mind grocery shopping either. And we're at a point now where Saturdays are pretty free. We went through that crazy time when we had no time on Saturdays, but often he and I go to the grocery store together.
Right.
Most Saturdays. If something's going on and either I have to run or he runs, not a big deal. But I think our preference is we go together. And why not?
I mean, it's time you can spend together.
Yes. And I remember when we were newly married. So at the time, I graduated with my bachelor's. My husband wasn't back in school. He had done some schooling and eventually he went back. But I hadn't started my graduate program yet. And so we were double income, no kids. And neither of us worked on the weekends. And so on Saturday, we would go to the grocery store together because we needed to do that. We'd also go to Lowe's or Home Depot, or we would just run errands together. And it didn't take that long. And I remember talking to my mom on the phone once. And my mom was like, oh, what are you doing? And I said, oh, we're going to go to the grocery store. And she got mad at me. And she was like, Jackie, I raised you better than that. I remember not being clear what I was doing that she raised me better than. But she said, that is the biggest waste of time. Again, single mother, right? It would be so much more efficient for you to go to the grocery store and for him to go to Home Depot, Lowe's, whatever, than for both of you to do both of that. That is the most inefficient way of doing this. And I said, well, I don't think our goal is efficiency. We have the whole day to do something. And so we're not on a time crunch. And so the goal is not efficiency. And my mom was of the opinion that efficiency is always the goal. Mm-hmm. And if you're not doing it efficiently, you're doing it wrong. But again, she's a single mom. We had no kids. And so I'm just like, I'm sure she got off the phone dismayed, thinking, how could I have raised this child to be this inefficient, right? And I got off the phone thinking, yeah, there's a time for efficiency.
This is not it.
And there's a time that you don't need to be efficient.
Right.
And our goal is to connect and spend the day together. Right. We don't really care how we're doing that.
Well, and really in the world that we live in, Josh, my partner, and I, we both work full-time jobs, and we have a 7-year-old who's involved in comp sports. And so sometimes our only days are the days that we have to run errands, and we don't want to not spend those together.
Right.
We have great conversations in the car ride.
Yeah.
And, in Costco when we're all the time. But I think that there's a level of that where it's just we want to spend time together.
Right.
And again, like if you eat in America, you should be going to a grocery store.
Right.
That's such a bizarre, like, what?
But
Why
then
is
that goes into men don't cook. Men
Right.
don't like all of those things that I will say we've had single male therapists work for us, and they know how to cook, and they cook for themselves, and just in simple conversations they'll talk about, oh yeah, last night for dinner I made da 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 da, and it's just them. And you know what, they didn't heat up a hungry man. They actually made a meal. They actually had vegetables
Right.
and meat and whatever. And so again, maybe my exposure has just been very different living in a red, very conservative state. I don't know how I had a different experience.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know either, because the reality is that the person in my family that did cook was my dad. Like my grandmother was like hell bent on no child of mine is going to starve because they don't know how to cook a meal. My dad is the one that taught me how to cook. And my mom, who did have very dysfunctional addict parents, didn't learn how to cook until she married my dad.
Okay.
My dad taught my mom how to cook.
Yeah.
And so that's just such a bizarre, like, weird hill to die on, I guess.
But if you don't know different, you hear this, oh, men don't go to the grocery store. Real men don't go to the grocery store.
Which is sad.
Yes.
And again, also why I always think about this because PBS was, I didn't have cable growing up. I lived in the boonies. And so most of my TV watching was PBS. And I learned a lot from Fred Rogers and Bob Ross. I learned a lot from them. And, I think about our idea of masculinity and really toxic masculinity, because I don't know that anybody would argue that Fred Rogers wasn't a real man. He served in the military. He was a pastor. He had some male gender role things, but also he was incredibly compassionate. He believed in teaching and educating children. He believed in having conversations. And like the whole concept of anything a male is what women are not, just seems foolish to me. But also handicaps men at the knees. Like, right, like you should know how to cook for yourself. You should know how, like, you should learn how to lean into that experience. Also, I want to be clear, whatever that is, the top 100 chefs in the world are men.
Right.
So like,
and they know their produce. They're picky about that. If you've watched any of their shows, they are picky about their produce.
Right.
But also, I've had single clients, both men and women, who tell me one of the kind of good places to meet other single people is at a grocery store.
Right.
Like, not Saturdays, right? But on a Friday evening, on any weeknight evening, and you can kind of tell because they're not hurried.
Yeah.
And they're like, they just have to buy groceries, right?
And you can just have a conversation.
And apparently now that's become a green flag. If they're at the grocery store, they didn't get the message that real men don't go to grocery stores, which again, I just think is so ridiculous to send that message, because men are going to die young then because they're more likely to eat fast food.
And I think that there is a beautiful thing. I just think about all of the men in my life who I would consider healthy or mentors or things like that. And it was around the teaching, right? Like they took the time to teach.
Right.
And I think that's what dads can do.
I think this is an important conversation. We experience this with both our partners and our male addicts as they're getting into long-term recovery. It's an area where I find with a lot of my male clients, they naturally start to show up there. And yeah, they will say, oh, my wife didn't like that, or maybe I'm doing it wrong. But they've spent some time understanding themselves and really solidifying this sense of self. And so usually that's not, sure, we can make mistakes, but it's not wrong the way they're showing up. And, so sometimes we have to have that joint session and work with the partner and allow her to give voice to the frustration and the impact on her as a parent, having to largely do it alone and trying to not rock the boat, in order for her then to get past that and see the benefits that she also gets to adjust her parenting, and that this is good for the kids to have two parents and to see that role. But, in America right now, there's a large population of kids growing up without two parents, and two parents is a luxury. And so there's kind of two theories out there. The one theory says we should be promoting marriage more. I mean, that's a conservative perspective. The other perspective is we're probably not going to go back to that. Promoting marriage as a way to be sexual, or marriage, like getting married because we're pregnant, that never really worked out that well.
It doesn't really promote the parenting part.
One of the people out there talking about this, his name's Robert Reeves, and he's got some good stuff out there on this. There's several books on this, but he says, I think often parenting is more likely to lead to marriage. Not necessarily that you have kids out of wedlock, but some people do. And you know what? That's fine. They eventually get married because they were intending to. I know one of the things we've talked to our kids about is when you're dating, especially because they're all married, they could get married. Only one of them is. But we have said, you also have to be thinking about what would it be like to parent with this person. And some of my kids are like, I don't know that I want kids. And I'm like, that's fine. But thinking about parenting or owning a dog with this person, whatever that looks like.
Right.
You should have an idea of what that looks like. Are they going to be able to be present? Are they going to be able to have an influence? What does that look like, right? Can they have conversations? Whether you have kids or not, I think that says something about partnership. And so anyway, I just think that's something that we need to start defining for men, what an important role they play as fathers, and even just adult men in their communities. I know the Boys and Girls Clubs and Big Sisters, Big Brothers, they're almost closing down because they do not have enough men, mostly, to support the program. And they have a lot of boys who are in need. And so, again, I'm not saying you have to join one of those programs. One of my brothers did. Maybe he was in his 20s when he was a big brother. There's a role, an important role that men are playing that they don't realize that. And that's having a trickle-down effect. And there's value there.
Yeah, for sure.
Any closing thoughts from you?
I just think that this is more of a discussion than a how-to, and I do think it is a discussion that we need to keep having.
Yeah.
As a society, as individuals, and to talk about what do we want to define this role as.
Right. Okay, at the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.